Okay, so this video is about a few things. I'm gonna try to summarize it. I've been reading a little bit of William James, and this is, I guess, on the lines of around the lines of contemplative science and its implications for understanding consciousness. Um, okay, so William James proposed a very interesting philosophy, I guess you could say, and an approach to the human being as a whole. He basically says that the very grounding, or the very basics of a lot of science and a lot of philosophy is the belief that there is a subject and an object. I mean, it all begins there, we're the subject, and this is the object out there that we're observing. And he thinks this is like the pillar of modern science, well, at least some parts of modern science, and mostly of philosophy and the social sciences, subject and object, groups and the objects they observe. Uh, it all begins there, this dualism. And William James says with radical empiricism that no, that is not the base, that is not the pillar from which everything grows. The pillar from which everything grows is oneness. And he's not saying this in any kind of obscure way. He actually just says that, look, the fundamental grounding of consciousness and our experience of consciousness is unified. Your brain has created everything that you see around you already before you start to pick it apart and conceptualize it. The immediateness of your experience is one, it's unified, it's not broken up. You don't see yourself as separate from the mountain you're observing. You see yourself as immediately. You don't see yourself as one or not one. There's just this unity experience that we begin to break apart with our rational minds. So really, the grounding of all experience is just fundamental isness, or fundamental consciousness. So we just have this base experience from which everything else is grounded from, and that is not what a lot of the Western philosophers have said. The base of consciousness is subject and object, thinker and thought. Um, but it says this is not, no, it's not two-ness. Two-ness is the mistake from which a lot of modern philosophy and ancient philosophy has had problems with. Um, Let me see. I have a pretty good quote about this, if I could find it, though. This is actually a good quote from this book, Brief History of Everything. I do recommend it. There's a few issues with Wilber, but he's got a couple interesting notes, especially about this. So I'm just gonna quote him on William James. All right. So William James said in his essay, "Does Consciousness Exist?" He says, if you look at consciousness very carefully, consciousness itself is not a thing. It's not an object or an entity. If you look very carefully, you see that consciousness is simply one with whatever is arising. As we saw with the mountain, for example. You as a subject do not see the mountain as an object, but rather you and the mountain are one in the immediacy of an experience, of the actual experience that you have. Your brain has already just unified the entire experience. It already is one, before you break it up. So yeah, you and the subject do not see the mountain as object, rather you and the mountain are one in the immediacy of the actual experience. So in that sense, consciousness as a subjective entity does not exist. It's not a separate something that has an experience of a separate something else. There is just, he says, one taste in the immediateness of experience. So if you really think about it from a neurological level, whether or not there is a subject and an object is probably beyond what we can really know, because we're stuck within our brains and within the experience. We can only observe what we observe. But at any rate, the very grounding of our consciousness right now is our brain has already put everything together. Our brain has already created the experience of me talking on this computer to you. I mean, this is all just like one experience. It's already immediately unified. There's no need to create an object or a subject. It just is, And we then, out of habit, and probably because this is built into our brains, to start dissecting it as well. But the fundamental basis of reality is not that breaking apart. it is first that unity of the immediate experience. You and the mountain are one. Then you decide, then you conceptualize that you are separate from it. But the thing that is more real is that unity, that oneness, immediate oneness with the actual experience. And the two-ness comes after. And if you want to break it down, you can say, look, this dualism between subject and object is the artificial thing. The thing that is real, with this radical empiricism, this radical immediate awareness of our own consciousness, is that everything is already one. Everything is one, and then we break it apart. And this is a fundamental difference from, two-ness that is of the West. Now, not necessarily incorrect, but that comes after. I guess you could say this is an alternative realm of thought that hasn't really been pursued too much in Western science and philosophy. But I at least feel this is just as much, if not more, valid than the two-ness of dualism, the Cartesian dualism. Because you're right. I mean, this is correct. There is just this one immediate experience that we then break apart. But your brain has already put it all together. Your brain has created this simulation, which in this instant is. And then only later on do we begin to dissect it and conceptualize about it. But really the pillar, the base of everything is this unity. Whether or not it's ultimately true is besides the point. If we can recognize that in this moment, when it's tricky, you have to, sort of make it click, and, it kind of hits you, like it's almost like a trip, like, oh my god, everything, whoa, like, I mean, this is a direct sensual sort of thing that you gotta exercise, that you have to put yourself through. But when it hits you, I mean, and this is something they explore in Buddhism, in contemplative science. They consider that because they begin here. I mean, Buddhism truly is. I mean, introspection and Eastern philosophy truly is just as much of a philosophy, because it begins even before the dualism. It begins there at that immediate experience, and it tries to understand that and relate that to the world. And it actually tries to remain in that grounding experience. In Tibetan Buddhism, you begin with this pointing out, this exercise that we've just done. You begin with that, and then with that recognition, you begin to try to make that more present in your life. You begin to recognize it more consistently. So it's not that you're trying to gain enlightenment, you're just trying to recognize the immediacy of enlightenment to begin with. So interestingly enough. And then he goes on to say Bertrand Russell had agreed with him about this. He says, the main purpose of this essay was to deny that the subject and object relation is fundamental. It had until then been taken for granted by philosophers that there's a kind of occurrence called knowing, in which an entity, a knower or subject, is aware of another, the thing known, or the object, the two hands of experience. The knower was regarded as a mind or a soul. The object might be a material object, an eternal essence, other mind, or in self-consciousness, identical with the knower. Although almost everything in accepted philosophy was bound up with this dualism of subject and object, the distinction of mind and matter and the traditional notion of truth all need to be radically reconsidered if the distinction of the subject and the object is not accepted as fundamental. So if we are one with everything, I mean, we really technically are. We're one with the universe. And our consciousness begins there. So that's a very interesting step. And if we sort of use that step to kind of see things differently, imagine what philosophies may become in the future. Maybe perhaps radical empiricism and this whole attitude was a little bit ahead of its time, because we obviously didn't take this in psychology. In psychology, we have this dualism. Perhaps this separateness, this illusion of separateness, is the problem, is one of the main primary, primal issues that we have as a species, because if I am other, if I am not my environment, if I'm not one with my environment, so to speak, then I must protect myself from the environment. So at the very beginning, this dualism creates an insecurity, and perhaps that is a very large issue that must be looked at psychologically, philosophically, and perhaps sociologically, if this can be seen as a larger problem, which it is, of society as a whole. So perhaps Krishnamurti, who talks about this too, Eastern, I guess you could say, philosopher, would be able to, is a good approach for the social sciences to see how this generates society as a whole. And philosophically, psychologically, Jung and other people can be looked at through this, as well as Wilber and William James. So, yeah, thanks for listening.